What's up everyone? In this video, we're going to start on scene transitions. But before that, I'm going to add a new grass tile set and do a bit of level editing. Let's first go to our overworld tile map. That's where we have the other grass tile set. And we'll click on tile set. Let's click on this image right here. So we have this image from previously, and I actually added a new image. So let's click on the plus sign right here. Go to assets, tile sets, and grass tile set. We went over this in a previous video, but let's first create a new auto tile and let's select the region, all the tiles right here. And we also want to add bit mask. So we set up our auto tiling. So we go to auto tile bit mask and we set it by 3x3. Let's rename this while we're here as well to grass 2 auto tile. And let's go to the bit mask tab. And I'm just going to follow what I did for the previous grass tile set. All right, that should be good. Let's save this. And there's no collision because we can walk on this tile set. Now I'm going to do some level editing. I'll speed through this part. All right, now it's time to add our house. So I'll go to our town and then Control A to add a new node. And I'll make our house a static body 2D. I'll rename it to be house. And I want to save this as its own scene as well. So save branch as scene, and I'll just leave it as house. I'll click on the edit icon and let me zoom out. And let's start off by adding a sprite to our house. I think texture rect will work just fine as well, but in case we want to add animations later on, let's leave it as sprite. And I have the house picture under buildings and then house 1. Let's go to offset, take off centered. Now let's also add a collision shape to our house. Collision shape 2D. Let's create a new rectangle shape. Then I'm going to fit this to the house. Go to transform and then set the X position to be 40. That looks fine. And then click on the rectangle shape again, and let's modify the extents to fill up the house. So Y, let's try 32. Then X, let's try 40. And that looks good. So we'll leave the top tiles without any collision, so it will appear like the player is walking behind the house. Let's also click on house again, and let's set the collision layer for the house. So let's go to the collision field, and we'll set it to be on the world layer, and it's looking towards nothing because the player would be looking towards the world layer. And that should be fine. Control S to save. And let's go back to the town, and let's position our house. Then I'm going to also add some grass tile set coming out of the house as well. And I'll also move the flowers out. I think I had extras, so I'll delete these. And I'll rename this to be flowers. All right, great. Now let's click play and let's see if we can interact with our house. So there is collision set up, but one thing that I notice is from the front side, the house looks like it's rendered on top of the player. And that's because we need to add our house to the Y-sort node, and that should fix it. Just click play again. And now it looks a bit more natural. All right, great. Now we want to be able to enter the house and go to a totally new scene. And before we do that, we have to play the door opening animation and then transfer our player to a new scene. So let's get started on that. Close this. Let's go back to our house scene and let's add a door. Well, obviously we have a door already here, but we need to add a special door that's able to open. So let's create a scene for that. So within house, let's press Ctrl A and let's add a door. And we'll make our door an area 2D. Let's rename it to be door and let's save it as its own scene. Save branch as scene. Save. Great. And now let's open it up and let's add a sprite to our door. And under door animations within our asset folder, there is a house 1 PNG. Add that there. And as you notice, there's 3 frames vertically. So let's go to animation and H frames should stay as 1, but V frames would be 3. And let's go to offset and we'll turn off centered. Let's go ahead and add an animation player to our door as well. And actually, before I go ahead and add animations, we notice that there's an exclamation mark because we need to add a collision shape to our door. So I'll click on door, Control A, and let's add a collision shape as well. Create a new rectangle shape 2D. Transform would be 8 by 8 to center it. And the extents would be 8 by 8 as well. Great, now we have a collision shape. Let's go back to our animation player and let's create a new animation called open door. Since there are 3 frames, I'll make the length 0.3 seconds. So each frame will play for 0.1 second. Now zoom in. Now let's click on sprite and we want to keyframe our frame property right here. So we'll start off on frame 0. Let's create a new track. Frame 1. Let's key that. And then the last frame. We also want to animate another property. And this property would be under visibility. And we want to animate the visible property to be on here. Because we're going to have this door invisible so that the fully closed door is visible on the original house. Great. And now let's add a new animation. And we'll call this closed door. Actually, I'll just duplicate this animation and then rename it. And we'll play the animation in reverse. So let's go back to our sprite and the first frame would be the frame 2. Let's key that. Frame 1 and frame 0. And at the end of the animation, we can set the visible property to be off so that the house door is shown rather than the picture from this door scene. Now that we briefly set up our door scene, we now need to have our player detect a door and figure out when we're entering a door and when we're close to a door. So we can go to our player scene first and update the script. And also, let's create a new raycast 2D. So we have a raycast for checking anything that's blocking the player. We have a raycast to check for any ledges that we can jump over. And it'll make sense to have a raycast to check for any doors that we can enter. So let's click on one of the raycasts, Control D to duplicate, and let's rename this to be door raycast 2D. And when we select the door raycast 2D, let's also go to collide with, and we want to collide with areas because if you remember, our door is an area 2D, not a static body 2D. And we also have to create a layer, a collision layer for our door. We have player, world, ledge, and let's create another one for door. So let's go to project, project settings. And if we scroll down to physics and 2D, no, not that, layer names and 2D physics. And then we'll add another layer called door. That looks good. Close out of there. And we'll set the collision mask to be layer 4. It hasn't updated, but that should be door. Now that that's sorted and we have our door raycast, let's go to our player script. Let's scroll all the way up. And I first want to add two new signals. So I want one signal to indicate that the player is entering the door, so we know when to play our door opening animation. And we also want to have a signal when the player is fully in the house. So player has entered the house, so we know when to play our door closing animation. So we can do signal player entering door signal and signal player entered door signal. Now let's also get access to our new raycast on ready var, and we'll call it door ray. And it was called door raycast 2D. Let's scroll down to our move function. And right here, so we'll do the same thing that we did with the other raycast. So I'll copy that. And instead of ledge, I'll do doorway and have it update. And we'll add one more case here. So I'll change this to be else if, and then if door underscore ray is colliding, and we do our logic here. Okay, so first we want to emit the signal that the player is entering the door. So this happens when we first enter this if condition. And we can check for that if percent move to next tile is equal to 0.0. And then we can emit that signal. Emit signal, player entering door signal. And then right after that, we can update our percent move to next tile. Copying this, pasting it there, and it's not jump speed, it is walk speed. Now we do similar logic. So we're moving a total of one tile. So percent moved to next tile, if it's greater than or equal to 1.0. So in this case, this means that the player has fully moved one tile. So we can say that they're inside the house now. First, set the position to be, I'll copy it down from here. And instead of times 2, it'll just be tile size. So one whole tile. We'll set percent moved back to 0. Is moving back to false. And at this point, we want to have our player disappear, at least visually. So we can probably play an animation here. Player disappear. And we also want to emit the signal that the player has entered the door. And I don't want to do that immediately, right when they move to the next tile. I want there to be like a half a second delay before we send that signal. Then the door closes. So a good idea would be to add another animation called player disappear, which lasts for 1 second. And once that finishes, then we can emit the signal. So let's go ahead and do that. But before that, let me do the else case here. And we set the position, and we can just copy down here. We're just interpolating the position depending on what percent moved is. Let's go to our player animation player, and let's create a new animation. And we'll just call this disappear. And I'll actually make this fairly short, so 0.1 second. And I want to animate the visibility property of the sprite. So let's go to sprite, go to visibility, and I want to set it to be off. So the player disappears. And also, we need to emit the signal that the player has entered the house. So we know to close the door and also transition the scene. And we can do that by calling a method at the end of this animation. And let's go to player and let's define that method. So similar to finish turning, we'll create another function called entered door. And in this function, we'll emit the signal player entered door. And then let's go back here. We'll create a new call method track on our player and right click at the end. And let's call the entered door function. So right when the player finishes disappearing, we'll signal that the player has entered the door. And we can use this signal to cause the door to close and also to transition the scene, which we'll later on implement. And while we're in the player script, let's make sure that the sprite of the player is always visible at the start, because now that we are animating the sprite to be invisible, let's just make sure that it is visible at the starting. And also, since I'm planning to delete this character scene whenever we transition to a new scene, let's clear the camera when that happens. So right here. By calling clear current, we'll just clear the camera that's attached to this player. And when we load up the new scene with another player, which is basically the same thing, that camera can take over cleanly. And we also need to call our animation player, and we want to play the disappear. So there's one thing to note. While we finished moving right here, we play the disappear animation, and that's for 0.1 second. And during that time, we actually can move because it says is moving is false, and we go back to our normal logic where we're able to process moving input. And we actually don't want to move during this period. So what I can do is I can create a new variable called stop input. And this is a Boolean type, and I'll initialize it to be false first. And we can just do it in our first if case, if it's turning, or if stop input is true, then we can just return so that the player can't actually do any movement of their own. And we also have to go back to our move function and set stop input to be true. And we don't have to worry about setting stop input back to be false because I'm planning to delete this player scene whenever they transition to a new scene and recreate it. All right, that's all for our player script for now. And now let's concern ourselves with transitioning scenes. So right here, we have a scene called town. And right now I have it set to be the main scene. So whenever I click play, it'll play the town scene and wherever our player is positioned. And what we want to do is make it easy so that we can swap out town for another scene. To do that, let's actually create a parent to town called SceneManager. And SceneManager will always exist, and we can remove town and add a new scene whenever we want. So let's go ahead and try doing that. So let's click on the plus sign here. We'll create a new 2D scene. Let's call this Scene Manager. And I'll save this scene. And I want to create a new node, a node 2D, and we'll call this current scene. So the main scene that we're on. And here we can add our town. And for screen transitions, it's easy to do it with this setup. So I can add a canvas layer which stays to the player's screen and have it fade to be black whenever there is a screen transition occurring. So let's add a new node, and this would be canvas layer. And I can call this screen transition. And I can go ahead and add a color rect to our canvas layer. And we can have this be the black screen whenever we transition screens. I'll set it to be fully black. And I also want it to cover the whole screen. And I can do that by going to layout and then selecting full rect. And it'll cover the entire screen of the player. And I also want to animate this screen from transparent to fully black rather than having it immediately be black. And we can do that with an animation player. So let's add an animation player. And let's create a new animation called Fade to Black. And we start off by animating the color rect, and we want to animate the color. So we'll click key, and we created a key for the color. And then let's click on it again, and let's change the value. And we want to animate the alpha, which is the transparency. So we'll set it to be 0 first. And then at the end, we'll set the color rect to be fully black. Alpha is back to 255. We'll key that in. And with that, we have a fade to black animation. We also want to create a fade to normal animation. So let's duplicate this. Let's rename it. Fade to normal. And we just have to flip this. So the value of the first frame would have alpha to be maxed. And the last frame will have alpha to be 0. Now let's go ahead and add a script to our scene manager. Click on this, create, and the scene manager is going to be in charge of fading in and out the screen and also adding in the new scene and deleting the existing scene whenever we walk through a door. So let's create a variable called next scene, and this will just store the string to the next scene. And I want to create two functions. The first one is transition to scene, and we'll pass in a string with the new scene in it. And I'll populate the next scene variable with new scene. And also I want to call the fade to black animation at this point. And we can access that by doing $screen transition and animation player dot play fade to black. And we need to call the fade to normal at some point. So let's create a new function called finished fading. And we'll call the fade to normal. And when we call the finished fading, at this point, we can delete the current scene and add in the new scene. And to delete the current scene, we'll get access to current scene. And we want to delete town, right? Or whatever is populated under current scene. So we can do dot get child, and we'll get the first child, which would be town in this case. And then we'll do dot q underscore free, which will delete the scene. And we want to add in the new scene. So we can do current scene dot add child, and we need to load this new scene. So load new scene. It's not new, it's actually next. And we have this stored here. And once we load the scene, we actually have to instance it. So load gets it in memory, and then we instance it, and then we can add it as a child. We can call the finished fading function whenever this animation is done. The fade to black animation is done. So let's go to our animation player, fade to black. And right at the end of this animation, let's add a call method track. And we're going to call it on the scene manager. Insert key. And then we'll call finished fading. That way, we have to call transition to scene once the player enters the door. And then once 1 second goes by, we'll call finished fading. We'll delete the current scene. We'll add a new scene, and then we'll fade to normal. Now I want to create a new scene. And this new scene would be for the player home. So inside the house. So I'll create a new 2D scene. And I'll call this player home floor 1, the first floor. And I'll save this scene. And I'm just going to have a simple tile map here for now. And then we can add in the details in a later video. So let's get our tile map. So we can go to town. And let's save our overworld tile map as its own scene. Save branch as scene. And I'll do the same to ledge. Let's go back to our player home. And I want to add the overworld tile map. Now I'm just going to delete all this and fill in with just grass for now. Let's add a YSort node. And then let's add our player to this node. And let's drag him somewhere here. And I noticed that our player is invisible. And let's just go back to our player scene and make him visible again. Okay, so this will do for our new scene. We'll edit it later on. Now let's finish up by making sure that our door works as expected. So let's go back to house and let's see where our door is. So our door is actually at this corner. So let's move it in the correct tile. So it's on top right here. And let's go to our door scene. And let's add a script to our door. Create. And let's get access to first the sprite on ready var sprite and also the animation player. And I'll call it anim player. delete that. And within the ready function, let's make sure that the sprite is set to be invisible. We want it only visible when it's opening and closing. And I also want to connect the signals that we added in our player script. If you recall, if I scroll all the way up here, we created a player entering door signal and a player entered door signal. So when the first signal is emitted, we want to play the open door animation. And those signals are in the player script. So we need to get access to the player node. So I'll do var player, and then we can find parent, and let's get the parent current scene. And if you recall, in our scene manager, current scene is right here. And the player is definitely underneath the current scene. So somewhere in town or whatever scene that we have. Let's go back to script, door. And we want to get the current scene. So get children dot back. And the reason why I do get children dot back. So if we go to the scene manager, we get current scene first, and then we want to get the children of the current scene. So it would be town. But there might be a case where there's more than one scene, and this could occur while we're transitioning. So we haven't yet deleted town, and then we added our player home scene. And there might be a few seconds while they both coexist. And we want to make sure that we get the latest player or the player in the new scene. So if I go back to the script, I get the children, so it can be town and player home in certain cases. And then I do dot back to get player home because that's the newly inserted scene. And then I just do find node and we'll find the player node within that scene. And that should get us the correct player scene each time. And now that we got the player scene, we want to connect the signal. So player dot connect, the signal name, player entering door signal. We're connecting it to this script itself. So we'll do self, and we'll call a function called enter door, and we have to implement this. And also for the entered door signal, we'll call a function called close door. And let's go ahead and implement those functions. So func enter door, and we just call the open door animation. And also close door. We'll call the close door animation. And once the animation finished playing, once the door is closed, we want to transition to the scene. So we need to call the transition to scene function that we have defined in the scene manager, transition to scene right here. So let's go to door script again, and we'll call this function entered, or we'll call it door closed. And then we want to call the transition to scene function. And that's on the scene manager. So we can do get node, node path, and we know the node path because it's the root and it's called scene manager. And then we can call transition to scene. But this takes in a string for the next scene. So we need to define that. So I'll just call it next scene path. And let's create a variable up top. And I'll call it export string file. And I'll call it var next scene path. And I'll have the default value set to be an empty string. With the export, it now shows up in the editor. So if I go back to the door scene, next scene shows up here, which is pretty neat. So every time we create a new door, we can supply a different next scene path. And I want to supply the player home floor 1 scene, but I want to do it within the house. Also, make sure that the collision layer over here is set to be door and the mask is set to be none if you haven't already done that. Let's go to the house, click on door, and the next scene path right here. So for this specific instance of the door, we'll set it to go to the player home. Let's go back to our door script. We need to connect the door closed function right here whenever the closed door animation has finished playing. Because right now, we'll just play the animation and this door closed function is never called. So we can call this by adding it to the animation player. So we'll go to the door scene, click on animation player, and on close door, right at the end, let's add a new call method track, connect it to door, because that's the scene with the script. Insert key, and then we'll call door closed. And then we can transition to our new scene. Great, so let's test it out. So before we click play, remember that we have the main scene set to be town. We want to change that to now be scene manager. So let's go to project settings, go to run under application, and we'll set the main scene to be scene manager. And let's make sure that the color rect is set to be 0, so the screen isn't dark when we load it up. And let's click play. Let's go in front of our door. And then right when I'm in front of the door, I'll press up once more. Cool. Next video, I'll probably go over adding another door within the player home so they can exit back and get back to the town scene. And also let's change this grass tile set to actually look like a home. Thanks for watching and take care.